way out. So if you like something tonight and you want to share it with a teammate or someone in your school, go ahead and take an extra set of copies. I also have more of the Preschool Coalition business cards. So if anybody wants that information for their families, just a reminder, that's just like a website that has different resources and tools for families. So what we did is we went ahead and put all that information on a business card to just make it easier to share with folks. Bathrooms are down the hall to the left. And I think that's it. Does anyone have any questions? Without further ado, you're up next.
All right. Thanks, guys. I am Ralph. I am in my first year as the behavior specialist for the county. Recently completed my board certification to become a behavior analyst. Prior to this year, I taught at Auburn Middle School for 7 years in the classroom, self-contained classroom for students with autism. Autism and working with people on the spectrum is definitely my passion, as well as using principles of ABA. And that combined with the significant rise in the occurrence of autism, I did feel like it would be important to do an overview of autism spectrum disorders. But when I get into ABA and behavior antecedent strategies and the specific interventions, these are things that will work for all of our kids. I think it's going to be some pretty good information for you. I'll explain the colorful handouts when we get towards the end of the presentation. If you have any burning questions during the presentation, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer some questions at the end. So appreciate y'all coming out tonight, and we'll get started. A lot of this might be information you already are familiar with, but again, I just wanted to pass it along. Autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder that affects the functioning of the brain. Diagnosis of autism is based on behavioral evaluation and not medical testing. And it's interesting when it comes to our students in school, because we can have some students that come our way that have a medical diagnosis but not an educational diagnosis. But we can also have students that have an educational diagnosis but not a medical diagnosis. Or we could have a student that has both. If you come across something like that, it's not that out of the ordinary. Diagnostic criteria are in the DSM-5. It's really great reading right before bed, light reading, if you're ever interested. And can be accurately diagnosed in infants as early as 18 months, but it's typically diagnosed later. But this is important because with autism, as well as some of our other students with special needs, early intervention is really key. The newest numbers that I have seen are 1 in every 59 school-age children are somewhere on the spectrum. And keeping in mind that it is a spectrum, different kids on the spectrum are very different. And 4 boys for every girl. I actually, in 7 years at Auburn Middle School, I never had a girl on my caseload. I had boys every year. And then, we think of, some of the ways that autism has been sort of, portrayed in Hollywood with movies and things like that. But savant skills are rare. But 2/3 have normal or above intellectual abilities. And autism occurs in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups around the world. 1% to 2% of the world's population. There is no cure, but there is definitive research showing that early and intensive supports is the way to go. And when we get into ABA, there are a lot of avenues that we can go as far as or people do go as far as looking for interventions and looking for strategies and looking for treatments. ABA has a lot of scientific backing, and we have a lot of success with using those types of interventions. And I'll get into ABA specifically because I do feel like sometimes it gets a bad rap, but I'll get to that in a bit. What we know does not cause autism. There's not appeared to be one cause, first of all. But it does seem that as we progress in research, it is a combination of genetic and environmental influences. These influences appear to increase the risk that a child will develop autism. But we know that watching too much cable TV does not cause autism. Vaccinations do not cause autism. Poor parenting, poor nutrition, cell phones. We have a very good idea that these are not part of the issue. This is an interesting chart when you look at the numbers from 1998 to present, especially that jump from 2004 to 2012 is pretty significant. A lot of people ask me, is it because, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself, I do that sometimes in these presentations, but a lot of people ask, well, is that because we're finding more ways or have better tools to diagnose? Is it because it's happening more? I don't know. It's unclear. But we have to make sure that we don't rule out the possibility that there is a true increase, despite our better tools for diagnosing. So when we think about autism spectrum disorder, we're really looking at serious impairments in social interaction and communication. And then there are some behaviors that I'll cover that do fall under that sort of unusual behaviors and interests category as well. Again, it wouldn't take you too long to get through it, I'm sure. I haven't tried. And so this is interesting because I will sort of contradict myself later because I am going to talk about Asperger's, because even though it is considered now a single autism spectrum disorder, I will refer to it as ASD for the rest of the presentation. ASD is considered a single disorder, so really Asperger's kind of falls into the high functioning range of ASD. But it is still a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. And we still have kids that have come through that were given a diagnosis of Asperger's. And so to our students who know that they are on the spectrum and have been given a diagnosis of Asperger's, it would be a little bit of an interesting thing to say, well, that kind of doesn't exist anymore, right? So it's sort of a sensitive thing, but so while we do consider it to be a single disorder, I am going to talk specifically about Asperger's syndrome and how that kind of differentiates itself, or at least kind of falls to one side of the spectrum. For a medical diagnosis of ASD, following criteria must be met. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interest activities, and symptoms must be present in early childhood. This is not, so it's interesting because as I said earlier, we have the means to detect ASD in children, as early as 18 months. However, you may have heard of cases, or I know, where we find that children seem to be sort of developing and hitting the typical milestones, but then it sort of falls off. It can go either way, but really this has to be something. This is not going to be something that's going to occur later in life. It's going to have to be diagnosed at a young age. Symptoms together limit and impair everyday functioning. So this is where we start when we look at our criteria. Again, generally we see that these sort of impairments begin before age 3 are different in each individual. Severe enough to cause problems in daily life and are lifelong. And in my classroom, from any year to year, I would have students who may not exhibit a lot of spontaneous language, all the way up to students who are accessing the gen ed for certain classes or for electives. So, even in my classroom of 6, 7, 8 students, there was the whole spectrum was represented. And so, again, this is what we're looking at here as far as really the key is that this is going to be discovered before age 3. And so this is what we see a lot of times as far as the social issues that come along, difficulty establishing peer relationships, show a lack of facial expressions and gestures, but also have a hard time understanding what those things mean in other people. May not respond to their name, not play pretend games. It's more of an abstract type of skill, may avoid eye contact, or may prefer to be alone. But not everyone with ASD wants to be alone. I know that that's something that we kind of think goes along with autism, is that students or children on the spectrum just want no interaction with people. And that is not true. But a lot of times it's just the lacking of the skills and the comfort to engage in those social situations and relationships. And as we're going to see, when we talk about our students with Asperger's, the students that are higher functioning on the spectrum, it really can be tough because a lot of these children want to be a part of groups and want to be able to interact and know they don't have the tools, and it can lead to anxiety and depression, and so it's something that we have to be cognizant of as teachers when we have students in our classroom. So another part of this is a person with autism might not point to objects or things of interest, have spontaneous shared attention, seem uninterested in people, but again, we know that that's not always the case. And so communication challenges. Now, again, these are things that I'm covering under the umbrella of ASD, but a lot of these things apply to a lot of our different types of kids. We may have issues with limited, delayed, or absent speech. Are you guys familiar with Temple Grandin at all? Have you heard of her? I've seen her speak a few times. She's this amazing, amazing woman, I believe in her 70s now, who is on the spectrum. She is a professor, has a doctorate professor at a university out west that is escaping me. But she's created over, I want to say 85% of the equipment that's used to corral cattle in big kind of dairy farm operations and things. She's brilliant. But she did not have language at all, any vocal language, until she maybe was 5, 6, 7 years old. And all through her life, she has dealt with some of the things that I've just kind of spoken about. Really had a rough time, especially when she started doing speaking engagements. They came out with a movie about her probably 10, 15 years ago now. Claire Danes played her. And after that occurred, and she may have been speaking before, but she really kind of became well known and does a lot of speaking engagements. Well, if her flight got delayed, it was enough to send her into a panic to the point where she might not be able to travel. And so she has, throughout her life, gotten better with these things and worked on these things, but it's been a lifelong thing for her. But she is amazing. If you ever get a chance to listen to Temple Grandin speak, she is just awesome. So a little tangent there because of language, but now we may see a behavior called scripting, repetitive language that might not be in context. It may be a phrase from a movie or a phrase that someone said that gets repeated. Poor conversational skills and may interpret language literally and not get some of the abstract and facial expressions and gestures, things like that. So again, the stereotypic repetitive use of language, sometimes we will see. Restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. So may have an intense preoccupation with particular items or topics. A lot of times our students that are higher functioning on the spectrum, it's a lot of times a one-sided conversation. They will tell you everything they know about something of interest, but are not always good at the reciprocating part of that. And have some inflexible adherence to routines and rituals. But we have a lot of students that need that kind of structure and need that kind of consistency. So some of the things we're going to talk about later are going to address those issues. So again, we're kind of going through here. You may see things like flapping or rocking or jumping. It's interesting. I worked really closely with Peggy Halliday from VIA. You guys you know her? Before I started with the county, our county for a behavior specialist actually contracted out to the Virginia Institute of Autism. And so Peggy came up and supported our programs for probably the last 11 years. And she was my supervisor as I was going through the program. She's wonderful. She told me a story about a man that she knows who is kind of in a corporate job as a team leader, runs meetings, and he is on the spectrum. And so from time to time, when he gets stressed, he has to go into his office, he has to pull down the shade, and he has to jump and flap. And he has learned a time and place sort of for that behavior, but it's something that he needs to do to regulate himself. So it's these types of things are part of a lot of who our kids are, and it serves a function. And when we start talking about behavior later, we're going to talk about, for all of our students, not just our students on the spectrum, behavior serves a function, and it's a way of communicating. Again, so we can see some of these, these issues with, anytime schedule changes occur for some of our students. Some, it's not an issue. Routines, ritualized patterns of verbal and nonverbal behavior, insistence on same route or food, repetitive questioning, things like that. And highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. One of the first students one of the first children that I ever worked with on the spectrum, before I started teaching, I worked for a nonprofit behavioral health company, and I got to learn about ABA a long time ago, and so actually getting to complete my BCBA was something I wanted to do for probably 10 years plus. But because of this, I had never seen any of the Star Wars movies. And because of this one child that I worked with, we would get our work done, and we would work to watch clips of Star Wars. And by the time I was done working with him, I had seen all the movies in short bursts, and so now I'm glad I did. But that was his high intensity interest. He could tell you every character, even the characters that the not so popular characters, all the details, all the situations, really, really interesting. And so this is something you might see too with a child on the spectrum, or some of our other children with special needs, is not necessarily playing with a toy or maybe a car, for instance, in a way that other children might, but really just having an intense focus on one part, like the wheel. So these are some of the things we might see. And again, in order to meet the criterion for autism, these things have to limit or impair everyday functioning. So in Virginia, again, we can have students who may have a medical diagnosis but not an educational, but it does go the other way around. Generally, if we get together with the eligibility team, testing has been done, and we may kind of, sorry, I have some different attachments here that I want to show you guys. So this is kind of what, it's hard to see, I know, and I know you don't have it, but basically this is kind of what an eligibility worksheet for a student with autism would look like, or for a student that may qualify for autism. The team gets together and reviews testing, and basically we start looking through these different types of criteria. Social interaction, restricted and repetitive and stereotyped patterns, like I just explained earlier. And then, as a team, if the child meets all of these criteria, we can then feel as a team that it's appropriate to go the route of autism, which, for a lot of students, it opens up a world of services that are extremely helpful. So, just wanted to show you that. That's my PowerPoint. So associated characteristics, and this is kind of where, while we may see these things with children on the spectrum, these are issues that many of our students can have. So I sort of want to transition, a little bit broader and away from autism on its own. But we have many of our students in any type of classroom that we can think of that have, display hyperactivity, have impulse control issues. Theory of mind problems is kind of, putting ourselves in other people's shoes, and that can be certainly difficult for students on the spectrum. Problems with imitation, motor skills challenges, sensory differences. So again, these are things that we can see in all of our kids, in all parts of the schools. And you guys are all preschool teachers? Awesome. I very much, one of my real kind of joys of this year has been getting to go into preschool classrooms and kindergarten classrooms. I taught middle school for like I said, for 7 years, and actually 2 years before that in Pennsylvania. And it was like first time I'm walking into these rooms, and it's like overwhelmed by cuteness, But you have to. One thing that I think I'm appreciative of my middle school and some high school experience is that a lot of times when our children, that we work with are younger, some of the things that are behaviors that are problematic are kind of, they can be cute, right? And so what I really try to do is think of what that behavior is going to look like when this child becomes a middle schooler. And so I try to use that as my basis for, is this something that we want to intervene with, or is it just something that, is kind of age appropriate, or, so these are the types of things we have to think about. But I really enjoyed coming into the preschool classrooms, and to be honest with you, Lindsay Grady, sometimes she says, I would like you to go into a preschool classroom, and feels badly about it. But personally, I think early intervention is the key, and so if I can be at all helpful when we have a person this big, and we can get some things going in the direction we want them to, that's a much better alternative than sometimes when it's someone that's this big, and not necessarily size, but because of years of learned behavior. The more years of learned behavior we have, the harder it is to sort of reverse some of those things. So I'm happy to come into any of your rooms anytime. Now, associative cognitive characteristics, difficulties with executive functioning. So we will see, especially a lot of times when our students on the spectrum kind of enter the middle school environment and are expected to have a little bit more independence, keep all things in a locker, travel from room to room on our own. This executive functioning, these difficulties start to kind of manifest themselves in disorganization, in losing things, in forgetting things. And so, we have to keep in mind that these executive functioning difficulties are a part of not only autism, but a lot of the special needs that some of our students might have. So, especially in middle school, we have this expectation that, students should be able to do this by this stage and this by this stage. But, depending on the student, that's not always the case. And so we have to keep these things in mind. And then, of course, problems with abstract thinking is definitely a big one for students on the spectrum. So when we talk about executive functioning, we are talking about things like attending, planning, problem solving, organization, impulse control, losing materials, messy desks, things like this. So, I'm pretty good at having a messy desk personally. And we have students that kind of are more organized than others. But when you see these types of things and you really want to kind of focus on the executive functioning issues that can occur with our students with special needs, it really has to be something that starts to impair ability to kind of function in the environment they're in to really kind of meet this criteria. And then, things like abstract thinking, any of this stuff, idioms, sarcasm, jokes, all this stuff can be very, very difficult for our students. And, a lot of times I've actually run programs to practice these things. And actually, I can remember having to do a math in 6th grade that was idioms. So that was always an interesting thing to teach, but I really enjoyed it because it gave us an opportunity to work on something that really was not just a 6th grade assessment and then forget it. It was really a skill that was, we could work on moving forward to help with just everyday functioning and socialization. So imitation skills can be tough for some of our students on the spectrum, but also, some of our students in general. And, some of these things, especially PE frustrations. A lot of times our students, especially on the spectrum, have a really hard time with rule-based games. Because, if I'm playing a game of kickball and I get tagged out by the ball, I realize that that's part of the rules, and I just didn't run fast enough to the base. But a lot of times our students on the spectrum will take that personally, as, you know, this person did this to me, that wasn't nice. And so a lot of times we have a lot of difficulties in PE settings. And so, again, that's something to keep in mind with our students. And so, you know, these are a list of things that may also accompany, may accompany autism, but also, you know, we see these types of behaviors in a lot of our students. And so, you know, when we talk about these types of, this type of language in general, when we're going to get into our talk about behavior a little bit here, a tantrum to me might look different than a tantrum to you. So we're going to go into and talk about kind of how we define some of these behaviors. Am I talking too fast? Are you guys feeling okay? Yeah? All right. And then, you know, we may have some sensory differences for sure. Light, sound, smells, pain, touch. You know, I've met students, through my time at teaching in the self-contained classroom that have had, you know, kind of all of these sensory issues. Some sounds. I've had some students that, you know, they have learned to wear headphones when things get a little bit too much. You know, we've been able to. I've had a student that wore sunglasses inside the building, and in some classrooms we even went to installing more LED type of lights because of sensitivity to the fluorescence. Not only the way they flicker, but even the sound sometimes. And so some of our classrooms are going to those LED lights to help with those types of issues. I've met some students that, you know, have real, do not appear anyway to feel pain sensitivity in the way that I might, you know. So, you know, all of these things can accompany, and they're important things to know about our students because, you know, if we have a student who just cannot handle fluorescent lights, let's say, and they're having a tough time, you know, if we can understand those things and be proactive about it and make some changes, that can change the whole dynamic of what we're dealing with. So, and then you know, again, these are some other things that we may come across with ASD and some other special and how not only how our students with ASD are all like other students, but all of our students with special needs are like other students. All students can learn. All have interests. All find some things difficult, and all have strength. All can contribute to the community, and all want social engagement. It may be limited, it may be variable how much social engagement we want. We're all that way, right? Some of us would prefer to just kind of do our own thing. Some of us are more reinforced by social situations, and so it's important to keep this in mind. And every person with autism is different, just like all of us are different. And with all of our kids, behaviors are likely to change over time. I think probably any of us that have been doing this for a while have learned to really, you know, kind of adopt a nice plan B. Because, you know, you think things are going to work. You think, man, I found the reinforcer. This is it, you know. And then 3 days later, could care less. So, you know, we have to be flexible. We have to monitor these things. And so now, like I said, when we talk about Asperger's syndrome, again, even though it's not considered its own disability category, I think it is important to talk about this population because in a lot of ways I feel like this is the population that can kind of struggle the most. A lot of times we see students with high-functioning autism, Asperger's, in our gen ed curriculums, and they're trying to make their way through elementary school or preschool or middle school and deal with all those social things and can't quite get a handle on it and don't understand why, and it really can be tough and take a toll on our students. And the thing is, you know, a lot of our students that are high functioning in the spectrum, if you were to spend 5-10 minutes with that student, you wouldn't know anything was what's going on. And then all of a sudden there's a meltdown. Because it just all became too much. And then all of a sudden, you know, we're like, where did this come from? And so, you know, that can be really, really tough on not only our students' with Asperger's or higher function on the spectrum, but also for us trying to get to know who they are. Again, difficulties with social interaction and communication, repetitive behaviors, sensory issues, rigidity, and then tantrum behavior may be provoked when routine is disrupted or aversive sensory stimulus is present. Now, in this case, though, there's generally no sign of cognitive deficits. Really well spoken. A lot of our students are super well spoken, but may have odd speech patterns. Commonly show intense interest in a specific topic. My Star Wars guy, he knew everything about Star Wars. He did not care too much about my interest in cycling. But, I tried, and we tried to reciprocate, and we got pretty good at it, actually. But, it's all good. Despite language abilities, though, experienced difficulty in relating socially to others and forming relationships. Again, kind of the same things that we were talking about with our overview of autism. The social cues and subtleties are really difficult. Personal space, figures of speech, facial expressions, sarcasm is a big one, and difficulty with that reciprocal conversation. And then also, we may have a student who is on the spectrum that, may come into our classroom someday and say, I really don't like your shirt, And it's because, it's not because there's any ill will or anything personal. They don't like your shirts, And so, these are things that we have to keep in mind when it comes to our students on the spectrum. And then again, we have our communication challenges that in a lot of ways are similar to our students' classic autism. So the issue we run into, not only with our students on the spectrum, but all of our students that are dealing with these types of things, is that we do kind of label these kids sometimes as the bad kids, as having bad behavior. Especially with our kids that are higher functioning on the spectrum, this behavior is not meant to be a class clown type of thing. It's communicating a need or something that's wrong. And there's just, some of our students haven't learned a more appropriate way to communicate that. So that's something we have to keep in mind. Again, children that are higher functioning on the spectrum know they are different and really may be self-conscious about this. And we have to be really have to work to not only work on some of these deficits and social skills, but empower them to pursue the things that they are good at and to, persevere when things are difficult. So early intervention is important in general. Highly structured and specialized programs, all of our students respond well to structure. And many methods available for treatment in education of people with autism, but most have no peer-reviewed search to support them. So I'm not going to get into that, but there are, treatments treatments, I'm going to say, that are all over the board. And not to say ABA is the only thing, that works. But when it comes to my point of view anyway, it really is important to do research and find the data that supports whatever intervention we're going to try with our students. And, the thing about autism specifically is there is so much unknown about autism, what it's caused by. We don't specifically know. Is there any way medically to address it? We don't know. And so for parents of kids on the spectrum, it's got to be so difficult to not know, why this is happening in the first place. And I know that there's this desperation to try anything that will work to help their children, but we really have to be careful as professionals, if we ever have a parent ask us about, something like, maybe chelation therapy, where it's a procedure to actually remove metals from the body, and it's been dangerous, There are things like that that people just are so desperate for an answer, they will try. And so as professionals, we really need to, if we're ever asked about something like that, it really is incumbent upon us to do our research and try to do the best we can to offer some advice in that way. And you know where I work, so if you ever have any questions about those things, feel free to share. So well, I'm going to get into now just an overview of ABA. Are you guys familiar with applied behavior analysis? Have you heard the ABA kind of thrown out there, thrown around? So ABA is really, it stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. It's kind of got, I don't think so anymore, but a lot of times when you see or hear about ABA, it kind of, the first thing that comes across is 40 hours of a week of sitting at a table and drill, what's called like these discrete trials. And it can be kind of, you know, if that's your only exposure to ABA, it can maybe look a little bit kind of almost militant, you know. There is a place for those kinds of discrete trials, and with our early learners who are really trying to get some basic, you know, abilities to request, to use vocal language in general, to label things, that kind of intense structured trial-based teaching really has a place. But that's not all that ABA is. So I'll let you read through that. But mostly because I need some water. It's funny. I worked as a musician for a bunch of years before I went back to school to teach, and I used to sing actually. And I could make it through night after night of singing, but I do one of these presentations, and it's like I can't talk afterward. But so the important thing here, anyway, is that we really want to focus on socially significant behavior. That's the big thing for all of our students, because you know we obviously have a mandate as teachers to make sure that our students achieve as high as they can academically, right? As highly as they can academically. But you know, in order for our students to navigate their way through the world, we have to really focus behaviorally on those things that are super socially significant, and maybe not the things that maybe annoy us. We have to, you know, as a teacher, you know, there were a bunch of things I wish that kid would stop doing that, you know. But I really had to think: is that the reason why they should stop doing that, or is it because it's socially significant and that it may cause them issues down the road? So that's the big thing here, is that this is really just, it's based on scientific principles, it's data-driven, and, you know, speaking of data, I'm not going to get into it too much tonight, but if you guys ever have any questions about, you know, ways to keep behavioral data, I got some hours for my board certification. I had to get 1,500 practicum hours, and 750 were direct service, so that was not so bad. But the other half was all indirect. So one of my jobs was to take all of these skill acquisition programs, hundreds of these things, and edit them and upload them into Blackboard. Hours of my life I'll never get back, but it helped me, you know, get my certification. So on our Blackboard, underneath, a lot of these data sheets are in the special ed link in Blackboard, but also we have a couple of links specifically for our autism program teachers and our cohort members. But if you guys are interested in that stuff, I can add you to the group, and you can look at all these data sheets and these skill acquisition programs, because they're really great. Yeah.
I think none of these are Faulkner County teachers.
Oh, gotcha.
So I think what we can do is pick a couple that we can share,
yeah,
and I can blast them out to the email.
Good to know. I did not know that. Well, yeah, but I can certainly, I can get a collection of those for you, and yeah, I can look at that. But anyway, data is really important, and we want to talk about socially significant behavior. So, ABA is a scientific field devoted to understanding and changing behavior. Objectively defines and measures behavior, and that's important. Focuses on socially significant behavior, and it's used to decrease inappropriate behavior and increase appropriate behavior. And this is a philosophy. This is not just a kind of a push-in service or a pull-out service. This is sort of a philosophy and a way of teaching that we can do in all environments. We want to decrease or modify challenging behaviors, teach new skills, teach appropriate replacement skills. Again, if we have a student who yells and screams and pounds the desk every time the schedule changes or there's a change in routine, if we can teach them instead to be able to say, I don't like this, right? Maybe it's not the most appropriate thing, but it's better than going into what we might call a tantrum, right? So we try to look at these replacement behaviors to kind of make stepping stones towards our desired behavior. And we always make our teaching decisions based on data and individualize them for each child. And it's not only for one-on-one sort of, sit at a table across from a student for 40 hours a week type of stuff. It's sort of a new field, although, it comes from Skinner, back to, if you remember your psychology classes, Skinner back in the 50s kind of came, this is all where this comes from. And it's not only for students with autism. So this field's been around for a while, even though it's sort of become popular, kind of outwardly popular as of late. But people in ABA work in all these different fields. And really what we're talking about is consistency. And so what we assume is that, and I think we as teachers in general, if a child is not learning, it's not the child's fault. We have to figure out how to reach that child and how to individualize the things that we're using to really reach a particular child. So when we talk about behavior, the word behavior itself kind of, you feel that child has behaviors. So we kind of put this negative connotation to it right away. But I mean, just me standing up here, waving my hands around is behavior. And so, we have to be careful of that. And it refers to anything a person does. And so, but when we talk about behavior, and if we're in a situation where we have a student in our classroom that has behaviors that we feel we need to track and we need to explain to other people, it's important that we look at examples like this where we want to say that he screamed at the teacher, right? He or she screamed at the teacher. We can see that occurred. We know it occurred. But we don't know if it's because the child or the student was angry. It might just be because they didn't think they were heard the first time, or it was just urgency, just really needed to say it. So behaviors must have one or more of these dimensions, which is our frequency, our duration, and intensity. And we really need to describe, we can observe, describe it, and record it by others, by the person engaging them. So, we have to make sure we're specific at this point. So, a lot of the times, the things that go on inside our internal processes are behaviors. But as teachers, it's important to understand if somebody has, if there's different trauma issues with a student, that's very important to understand, and it's very important to account for. But when it comes to the things that we can sort of change, or we can have some effect on, a lot of times it's going to be that observable piece. So, example of observable and non-observable language. And this is important too, because when it comes to if we write IEP goals, if we do write PIPs, we have to make sure that we're using these observable language and not, these non-observable terms. So we define behavior using observable, measurable terms that can be easily understood. And a really good thing to do sometimes is to include non-examples of behavior. So if we're talking about a child who is engaging in a tantrum, which includes yelling, crying, stomping feet, but maybe not banging on the desk or falling to the floor. So if you include those non-examples, sometimes it can even specify what that looks like even more. Because if you have to track a behavior across multiple settings or across multiple people, it's really important everybody knows exactly what they're looking for, or else we don't get reliable data. And given the time frame in which behavior should occur, sometimes when we talk about skill acquisition programs and if we want a certain response, we may want to sort of dictate that the child will respond in 10 or 15 seconds in order to get accurate data. And with behavior, we can count frequency, numbers of occurrences as well. So here's an example of, if we just say Bobby had a tantrum, again, that might mean different things to different people, all different people in the room. So it's really important that if we use that language, we are specific. So, take a look at the descriptions there of tantruming and studying. I know what studying looked like for me when I was in school, and it wasn't necessarily always this. So. So again, just important to be really specific when we talk about behavior. I'm going to skip through some of this stuff. When we talk about behavior, these are kind of our components we need to look at. Because if we do, have an idea of all of these things that are occurring in a behavior, it really helps us to identify the function of the behavior or why it's occurring. Another word besides behavior that has sort of those negative connotation to it is consequence. Oh man, mister, you're going to have some consequences, right? Consequences aren't always bad things. They are just exactly, specifically what occurs directly after a behavior. A consequence could be, I got an A on my test and I won an ice cream cone or something. You know what I mean? That could be a consequence. So it's not just you're going to have consequences. Our antecedent occurs directly before the behavior. What was the trigger? What was the thing that occurred? So if you were to take data on a student and you find that every time a work task is presented, the student engages in yelling and tearing up the paper and throwing it on the floor, you're going to have a pretty clear idea that the function of the behavior is task avoidance, right? Or if every time a certain person walks into the room, the student begins to say inappropriate things or start to yell or something like that, it might be a way of gaining attention, and it might not be something that, the student might not have a more appropriate way to do that. So it's really important to know what the antecedent is. Behavior is anything an individual does that can be observed, and then a consequence just occurs directly after the behavior. And so a lot of times consequences drive our behaviors too, right? Because if we engage in that, our work task is given to us, we yell and scream and tear it up, and then we don't have to do it, our behavior of yelling and screaming and tearing up our paper is going to be more likely to occur in the future. So, an example of just some regular, it's not just problem behaviors. These things exist in all of our behaviors. All right, so I'm going to keep moving through this because it is time's moving on, and I want to get to the good stuff here that is going to be helpful, hopefully, for you. This teacher, man, I know we're not reading it, but she kind of dropped an unannounced test on this poor guy, Johnny, and it was not very nice for her. All right, and review. We want to make sure whenever we're talking about behaviors of a student that we're specific. What exactly does the behavior look like? Measurable. Can you count how many times it occurs? Can you count how long it occurs? These are important parts of recording behavior because, the thing about behavior is, right, if we have a child that engages in a tantruming behavior, right, that involves crying, falling to the floor, yelling, and it happens for 3 hours, that's a big deal, right? We wouldn't want to use a frequency measure. We could say it only happened once today, but if it ate up, half of our school day, we really want to look into taking a duration measure on that more than a frequency measure. But if we have a short behavior, you know, if we just have a kid who, I would sit in my buddies, I had a student that would go in to my coworker and friend's history class because he was really interested in history, had a great knowledge of geography. And I was probably the problem behavior in the classroom because I tap, I do all kinds of things, and I think I drove my friend Kevin nuts in his classroom more than my student who was in his classroom ever did. But for behaviors like that, you know, it's a start, and it's got a specific beginning, it's got a specific end. So we might want to look into a frequency measure for that because it may occur 60 times a day. But we don't care how long it occurs because it's a short-lived behavior. So these are things we want to think about when we talk about behavior. And again, using those observable and measurable terms. And when we think about behavior, I like to think of it as the way we would explain an IEP goal or write up an IEP goal. We want to talk about specifically what we are seeing, you know, when the behavior occurs. So again, here's just another example. Non-compliant means something different to you maybe than it does to me. Task avoidant. What does hates lunchtime mean? I mean, you know, refuses to cooperate, loves the principal, but what does that look like? And so again, just, I hate to beat a dead horse, but it is important. And behavior is communication. Even, you know, some of the most severe behaviors we might see. I had a student a long time ago that engaged in really, really serious self-injurious behavior. And we kind of couldn't figure out what was going on. We weren't sure if there was a medical component. You know, we were kind of just racking our brains, and we went through half a year, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. And finally, we started to notice that the minute staff was too close to this student, it became a trigger. And being able to teach this student to vocally tell us that, you know, that he needed some space. And you know, so we would practice it in times when the student wasn't upset. You know, say, I need space, and you'd say it, and we would like dramatically jump out of the way. And you know, so that he learned that his language was useful, and that he could use that instead of having to go into the behavior that we were seeing. And when he was able to use that and use it not only in general, but when he really needed it, we saw a drastic decline in behaviors. So really important, though, to realize that it's not just because kids are being bad. A lot of times it's that there is some sort of mean communicated, and we have to figure out what it is. Peeps like me, taps with pencil. All right, so now I'm going to go into some general strategies, and then I'm going to go into a couple of specific ones that I brought with me, and that I hope you guys will enjoy. And so I think a bunch of these things really could help, especially at the preschool level. And I tried to gear some of the materials that I brought and some of the examples that I brought towards that age group. So when we say antecedent strategies, these are things we can do that before a behavior occurs, which will hopefully make the behavior unnecessary. That's the biggest thing. You know, there are times when we need to enforce some sort of consequence, and we definitely want to use positive reinforcement, which is a consequence. But if we can arrange things in the room, or make, you know, if we can make a behavior unnecessary and stop it before it starts, we're really doing something good. But we can adjust and change behavior by adjusting both antecedents and consequences. That's important to keep in mind. But we want to be proactive, and if we can change, like I said, the environment to make the behavior unnecessary, we're ahead of the game. Easiest way to deal with challenging behavior is for it not to occur in the first place. So we can prepare the environment. You know, and a lot of this comes from any information we can get from parents, previous teachers, things like that. The more we know about a student before they come into our classroom, the better. But you know, if we can use preferential seating, you know, kind of know, some of the physical characteristics of the classroom that we can kind of alter to help, that's a big deal. Proper classroom arrangement will help ensure on-task behavior. So One thing that I have found that really works well in classrooms is kind of when students know there's a specific place for everything. Sometimes our classrooms are small and we have a lot of kids, and that's not always easy. But knowing that, the kidney table over here is where we do our group activities, knowing that we have a book corner over here, we have, some activities we can, just when kids know that there's a place for everything and that they have a specific place they can go to do things, it really reduces anxiety. And, keeping the classroom consistently organized, which can be difficult, believe me, I know. And then classroom and individual schedules can be really helpful, and I have some examples of those coming up. Visual supports, we can post classroom schedules in a consistent place. Have it so maybe it's made of with Velcro tabs instead of a fixed schedule, because if we do have changes, it's nice to be able to identify those things in the morning before they happen, right? So math is going to be after reading today, or we're going to have an assembly during third period. Whatever it is, if you have a schedule that can be changed, that's going to be helpful. And if you can go over those things in the morning before it occurs, it's going to be really helpful. And then visual timers, pictures, and things like that. Visual timers I've found to be very helpful, for me personally anyway. But picture or textual schedule that says, stays with the student. Some students that I worked with, just really the first thing they wanted to do in the morning was see their schedule for the day. Once they saw it, they could wrap their head around it, and a lot of anxiety was kind of reduced at that point. Recreation areas, if possible, maybe not in the classroom, but a lot of our students need to get some energy out and need to have some sensory input. I had a student that he needed such deep pressure that we would go to the gym and play catch with a medicine ball. He needed that, kind of halfway through the day. And what I did was, I could look at the data that I was taking and figure out where the problem spots were, where the trouble spots were for him. And if I could kind of target those types of interventions and that type of, because it was a reinforcing activity to him too, target that before those trouble spots by using my data. I was able to avoid some of those behaviors that were occurring just because he had that outlet before we got to that point. Of course, we want to keep safety in mind. We unfortunately in my building didn't have a sensory room, but I did have a little corner that had a curtain that kind of could be pulled across. I had a tent over there for one student for a while, just a place where a student could go and just get away from things when they got overstimulated for a little bit. Any students who are easily distracted, face away from windows, doors, high traffic areas. Sensory issues, we had the little tennis balls underneath the chairs. Cover computers. Computers, obviously, you guys know, the electronic devices in general are huge draws for our students and can be big distractors. So if we have a way, just have a trifold board to put in front of the computer, while it's not used, just out of sight, out of mind kind of stuff. And then, we can work on desensitizing the distractions over time. Simple directions for some of our kids, not too wordy. We want to make sure that we have a variety of short activities for some of our students that have, issues attending to tasks for long periods of time. Having short little bursts of things can be really helpful. Recognizing students' differences. Again, it took me half a year with my one student to realize that his kind of issue with and I do feel like it was a sensory issue in a lot of ways, was just, we couldn't be that close to him, and those are the things, once you find out some of those things, it can really change a lot of what goes on day to day. We certainly don't want to force children into aversive sensory situations. Although I do have a student, though, that I've been working with this year who has some real auditory sensitivity and accesses headphones, but it wasn't his go-to, and he would become upset, would sometimes even, not because he was trying to be mean, but would kind of just grab, like, because he needed, it came across as hitting sometimes, but it wasn't that, but he just needed some help. And so we were not forcing him into aversive sensory, but we were in little doses. We knew things that were auditory triggers for him. And so with the help of the speech therapist and the occupational therapist, we could play little sound clips and practice going for those headphones and practice saying, I need space, or I need to go, or turn that down, or too loud, things like that. So we taught ways for him when he wasn't in crisis to access that information. And then it was awesome because, probably a month or two after we started that, we were in a high school cafeteria, and the football team, it was like pep rally week or whatever, and the football team got up on the tables and started making all this noise without any reaction at all. He just grabbed his headphones, put them on, and kept doing what he was doing. And so that wouldn't have happened if we didn't sort of introduce those aversive stimuli in a very controlled way and sort of teach him and desensitize him to those things. So, but anytime we can use environmental accommodations to our benefit, it's worth it. So again, some of our students don't like to be touched. That's a good thing to know, because sometimes a pat on the back is our natural go-to, but that might be very aversive to some of our students. So if we can't use that, we have to find alternate ways to prompt. Sensitivity to sounds, as I said, we have to keep an eye on our volume level with some of our students, using carpet on some hard floors like this, because if you walk in and you hear some creaks, that might be difficult. Headphones, things like that, desensitized as I did with one of our students to sounds over time, and quiet places. And then sensitivity to lights, lamps. We could turn the lights down. I've been in some rooms where teachers have these really cool lamps, multicolored lampshades, and it just creates a nice vibe for the kids in the classroom, the calming effect. Baseball cap, sunglasses, these are things we can do. And choice is a big thing for a lot of our students. A lot of our students crave control, right? And I always think, when students try to take control of their environment, a lot of times that manifests in something inappropriate that we don't necessarily want to see. But if we can provide choices that are dictated by us, it's a win-win situation, right? Do you want to do, in some of our self-contained classrooms anyway, do you want to do reading first or do you want to do math first? For me, I had a student that just could not do math first thing in the day. And that was what the rest of my students were doing. So he did reading during that time, and he did math later on. Because it was a battle I didn't want to fight. I realized it was an issue. And even though he had control of that situation, it was dictated by me. So, those are things that we can do depending on our environment to a greater or lesser degree. But sometimes arbitrary choices, like, do you want to do that in crayon or in marker? Do you want to write in blue pen or black pen? Do you want to work for 11 minutes or 12 minutes? These are things that don't make much difference, but the fact that the student gets a say in it and a choice can make a big difference for some of our kids. But when we offer choice, one choice we are not giving is to do or not to do. We're always going to do something. It could be, do you want to do this worksheet or this worksheet? But it's not, do you want to do it or do you not want to do it, of course. It could be materials topics, like I said, but we can follow the student's lead to a point. If we can get a student, at first, they won't do a worksheet, but if there's a picture of Iron Man on the worksheet, they will do the worksheet, then maybe we should give them some worksheets with Iron Man on it, and then we can fade those things over time. Students selected items, if possible, if they had a favorite pen or something like that. But choice is a big one. It helps because, especially if we're asking, we're prompting language, right? It increased task engagement because there's a stake in it, and interest and enthusiasm, especially if we're using some preferred topics and things like that, and we can definitely decrease problem behavior. And then this is a big one too. For some of our students that find things to be very difficult, start a work session with something that's mastered, with something that the students already know, and sort of develop some academic or behavioral momentum before you start that really difficult thing. And then if you're going to introduce a difficult thing, do it in little bits. If you can do something they feel good about, introduce that difficult thing, go back to something they feel good about, introduce another difficult thing. That's going to help it not to feel like a completely overwhelming task. And so you can do this with items within an activity or across a given time period. And again, typically, we do want to kind of, anything difficult that we're going to ask the student, it's good to, kind of proceed it with something that's a little easier to build that momentum. And these are things I think we do naturally. I think we get our kids and we want them to be invested in what we're doing. And consistency. If something works for a student with one teacher, really we want to try and use those things in other environments and with other individuals. All right, so this is going to be sort of the specific things that I wanted to talk about that could be helpful for you guys They've been helpful for me over the years. They're helpful for a lot of the classrooms with children with autism that I support, but also in our preschool classrooms and our ID classrooms and things like that. So visual schedules are huge. Just allowing the student to have a clear expectation about what's going to occur is huge. Obviously a lot of our students, especially our students on the spectrum, but most of our students rely on the consistency and the feeling that their day is under control and they know what's going to happen. And it's really good for some of our students to go over schedules first thing in the morning, especially if we're going to have a change. Yeah?
Do you want to just explain a visual schedule in case everybody...
I have an example. Yeah. And I'll show you in a minute. And one of the things about visual schedules is it can reduce compliance issues, because if you have a student that's got some compliance issues and you're constantly telling them what to do, they don't want to hear you tell them what to do, right? I mean, we all have had students that don't want to hear our voices telling them what to do. But I mean, if you can walk up to a schedule and be like, hey man, I don't make the rules, it says it on the schedule, it can reduce some of that conflict, and so the fact that the schedule says it, you can remove yourself a little bit from that sort of, that butting of heads that may occur from time to time. And so, in effect, the schedule is telling the student what to do. And so, it might look something like this. And again, this is something that I've had these, a lot of our teachers have these in our classrooms with laminated, with Velcro, and that way you can change the order if necessary. A few of our preschool teachers have them, and their students are independent in going up and removing that off that icon off of the board and putting it in the tray and moving on to the next thing. It's really helpful for a lot of our students. And so one of the cool things that we can incorporate with visual schedules is something called transition markers. So, I have worked with a student this year. I brought up Iron Man. He is like super into Iron Man. And the most, reinforcing thing to him that you can think of. So, transition marker, I'm going to explain it and then I'll show you how it relates to the visual schedules. So, allow students to place themselves within their daily schedule. So it's something that they use to transition from math, now it's time for reading, right? We can use a picture of a reinforcing person, a movie character, an animal that they like, and we can put it on this transition marker. So think about like a popsicle stick with a Iron Man's face on it with a little thought or speech bubble that says Iron Man says it's time for, right? And so if that student is really into Iron Man, that just moving their schedule, going from task to task, can be reinforcing in itself. And so, again, it takes you out of the equation. Iron Man's telling you to do it, and so for some kids that makes a difference. It really does. We can reduce compliance issues, conflict with teachers and staff. And so if you think about it, you have our schedule here. And that transition marker, there could be a little Velcro next to the right of the picture, right? And you could place that popsicle stick there, and then Iron Man says it's time for checking. Iron Man says it's time for reading. Iron Man says it's time for writing. So just a little thing that has really, I've seen work pretty well with students who are, all of our students are into something like that. It might not be Iron Man. They might really like bears. So, so the bear says it's time for, can be helpful. But visual schedules are really, really key. And I think they give our kids, a lot of our kids in general, a sense of understanding about what their day looks like, reduces anxiety, which is really, really helpful. And then along those lines, power cards. So some of our students who, may engage in some difficult behaviors, it can be a struggle. It can be a daily struggle to get some of our students to do what they want to do. But if they can have an example of their favorite person, their favorite cartoon character, who is modeling, in a sense, modeling what it's like to follow rules and giving them a description of that, it can be really helpful. I did one for a student, again, a student who really liked Iron Man, that actually it was just a little laminated piece of paper, probably that big, and it was on like a little flip ring. And so he could keep it in his pocket, and it said something along the lines of, when Iron Man was in school, he followed all the school rules. This is how he became a superhero. And then we had one for each period of the day. When Iron Man was at recess, he stayed on the mulch and did not run into the grass. Things like that, you know? And so that became really reinforcing, and it was in his pocket and something that he could access whenever he needed it. You know, Olivia, it's a good one. Cars. So, there's, you know, if you look these types of things up, you know, you can find them online pretty easily, but, you know, even if you know, if it wasn't Cars, if it was, I don't know, Elsa. What is that movie?
Yeah.
Frozen? Yeah, it might be, you know, you could change this up to look like that. Might be something that's helpful for some of our students. So, what I gave you there, those colorful handouts, are examples of some activities that you could put into an independent notebook or task boxes. So I'm going to explain what that is. Some people use binders, independent notebooks. Some people put them in file folders. I have some that I need them back, unfortunately, but you can pass them around and take a look. Especially, you know, I think at the preschool level or early elementary level, these types of activities can be really helpful because, you know, we have 8, 10, 12 kids in our class. Some of our students need our utmost attention at times. And then what do we do with our other students, right? If we have something that the students can do that is a known skill, something we want to review, you know, matching activities, things like that, I'll show you. I mean, it's something that the student can do independently and keep themselves on task. It can be very helpful if you can't be with them all the time. So the purpose of these things is to review, maintain known skills. We're not trying to teach new skills in an independent notebook because we want it to be independent. Independently follow a schedule. For some of these things, it's not that we even care about the task, really. We just want the child to be able to go through and complete a full notebook of something. Or in the case of task boxes, which I'll show you, take a picture over to a box, pull the box out of a cabinet, complete the activity, move on to the next. It's just really, you know, in a lot of cases, we're just increasing our students' ability to handle the structure that we dictate. And again, we can keep students productive when the teacher is required to work with other students. A binder or collection of boxes that activities can be completed without assistance of staff and required skills that are already known. So, as you'll see as you go by, this is an example of one a teacher in a K-2 autism classroom made. Many pictures like this, the student would flip through the book and match some of the pictures, trace the letters, things like that. I think she has probably 25 pages in here now, and a bunch of her students can just go through that and keep themselves on task while she's working one-on-one with a student who's acquiring new skills. And then task boxes might look something like this, where the child, each student on their desk has a laminated maybe piece of paper with Velcro on it that has icons that match all of the pictures that are on the boxes there. So they can take the red circle icon, they can bring it to the box, they can pull the box from the cabinet, bring it back to their desk, do the activity, then they can go and get their blue diamond and go to the next one. And they can go through all these different task boxes. And it's you know, I've found it to be a lot of times really motivating for kids because it's stuff they can do to feel successful. This incorporates some movement, which is nice because our kids need that. And if we don't structure their movement, sometimes it becomes just running around the room, right? So this is this and the independent notebooks I have found to be really, really helpful for especially classrooms that have, you know, big class sizes and you know, when you need to work with some kids one-on-one or two-on-one and you have to find something else for our other students to do. I probably went a little longer than you all would like, but that's what I got. What's that? Yeah, so feel free. Feel free to ask any questions. You might have. Yeah.
Do you have a kid that
when you have a student, yeah.
that you're just like he has a meltdown when he does the translation so usually in something how I should feel like he's or what do I say to them, to other kids? You know,
yeah.
Do you want to repeat the question to them when you get them?
Yeah. So a student, you know, cleaning up it's not a preferred task for that student, right? So in order to eliminate the need for the behavior, you're engaging him in something else, and then the other kids are like, why isn't he cleaning up? You know? And so, yeah, that's a tough one, because I run into that too, because sometimes I'll go into gen ed classrooms where I have to do an intervention plan, and it might be a sticker chart for a student, and all the rest of the students are looking at this kid getting stickered. Now, thankfully, I have found that most of the time, kids inherently want their friends to do well, and a lot of times their friends are supportive of them and actually cheer them on to earn those stickers. So in a case like this, though, it's tough. You know, if he could do something that was almost looked like a task, that was not necessarily that same task, can you bring this over here for me? Can you go bring this to this teacher? Something like that, or even, you know, and then you can sort of maybe work it in so you can you just clean up this one thing? Then can you clean up these two things? Then can you clean up these five things, you know?
Better.
Yeah.
And now he's only like holding on to one thing, you know, while he's cleaning up the other thing. Why does he get to hold on to one thing?
Yeah, no, I know, it's tough. It's tough. And so maybe what you could do too is if you had something that you could, you know, have that student do that didn't involve cleaning up, that was another sort of task, maybe, you know, he could bring a buddy with him, you know, and then it could be a different buddy next time. But, you know, yeah, that's tough. And you're always going to run into those things when a child has needs that are different from another. But I just think, you know, and I don't think it hurts to, you know, tell peers that, hey, you know, we're working on this. This is not something that's easy for him, and he's going to get better at it, you know. So, yeah. So, yeah.
How do you approach a parent that's even like issues
About
of the child's behavior and like obvious signs that something's that they're not?
yeah. No, that's tough.
You know, like here,
No.
and you just talk and then let them come to it eventually.
It's hard because, so, you know, and I'm guessing that a lot of your students, right, you know, we can have that, if we're talking about diagnoses anyway, and I know we're just talking about behavior, but I want to go there just for a second because of the DD label can be till 7, right? And so a lot of times, you know, we may, you know, not exactly know where a particular child fits in any case, in general. And so it's difficult because when it comes to, you know, interventions, and especially behavioral interventions, you know, we may think, okay, we have a student that comes in and they have a DD label, but we kind of see some of these tendencies that might be the autism, right? So we don't know. But we can use these interventions for all of our kids to have behaviors, first of all. When it comes to communicating this to a parent, I'm going to tell you data is the best thing you can do. Data doesn't lie. So if there's a way that you can keep frequency data or you can keep duration data, and you know, what I like to do too is I have this data sheet, and I'll show you. I don't think I can give it to you because it says Fauquier County Public Schools on it, but you can find one here. And it's sort of a frequency data count, but it creates a scatter plot sort of at the same time. So and you guys can pass this around too if you want. But basically, you have your 5 days of the week, and you have your half-hour blocks of the day. And if you can start, you know, putting some tallies in there, and you can find patterns, and you can then present this to a parent and say, listen, you know, the whole day is going really well, but for some reason, at 11 o'clock every day, we're having an issue.
But it's more than, it's not, obviously it's some behavior, but it's not tangible, it's not, it's more like the echolalia.
Gotcha.
It's receptive expressive language, it's a whole lot of things, social, it's those things that are just.
That's where it gets tough, and I think.
And that's hard to.
But it's very apparent.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and that's the difficulty. Well, I think that's kind of why I brought up the whole DD thing, because, you know, there is a time for sure that we can go until it's 7 years old, right? With that label, and so for you guys, that's tough. You know, I think if you can just, you know, not only keep good data, but, you know, I don't know, you have to talk to your administrators, eligibility team.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in too. Sometimes you can just say, you know what, I'm not sure what's going on, but you can call Child Find. They can do a screening, and let's see if they can pick up on some strategies that can help me in the classroom.
And
I think a lot of times, if you do that,
and then you just let it go after. I mean,
well,
I don't say let it go, but I mean,
sure.
Can you
So
say that
if they don't
several times?
follow up with the Child Find referral, then yeah, I mean, you do have the right to make anyone can make a referral at any time. Where it gets dicey, though, is you are giving us confidential information. So you have to weigh that out, and then when we make the phone call to follow up, that could go one way or the other. So, you know, it's tough, and I think you just keep bringing it up. And sometimes speech is a way that, you know, it's hard. We try really hard. I mean, and I think sometimes we just kind of have to step back and take a look at it from the point of view of the parent. It's hard to accept that, you know, everybody's giving you the best that they've got. And so no one says, oh, this is my practice round, let me know how I did. You know, this is their pride and joy. Yeah.
So the answer to your question is there is no easy answer. But I mean, I would say though, if that's something that you're, so say you want to focus in on maybe the echo. If you did have a sheet like this where you were tracking how many times that was occurring throughout the day, and you were to present this to a parent, it would be tough probably for them to maybe see, but it's also very powerful.
Yeah, a lot of times if you can just describe what they're doing, rather than giving an opinion of it, just, hey, I'm noticing this, have you mentioned it to your pediatrician? Or this might be something you want to share to see if there's anything. I just know when I was in the classroom, a lot of times when I would be in situations like that, I was like, I need some strategies, you know, couldn't have the other thing too is sometimes you can ask for a release of information so that you can work collaboratively with the pediatrician. So sometimes that's your in too, because they can approach it from a medical standpoint. And sometimes, you know, and the way we approach it is we'd like to work collaboratively, which is true, because sometimes folks like Matt have strategies that, you know, we might not have, whereas a pediatrician might see something different that can help us. So it's basically trying to get everybody together, and I think when you approach it like, we're trying to help, we're trying to work as a team, but it's hard.
And I think they're kind of aware, but they're trying to work on it themselves.
Yeah. No, I understand.
And basically it's like, well, we're going hard on it.
Right.
And as a teacher, it's so hard because you know they're missing out on the early
The
intervention.
early intervention
Right.
we're talking about.
Right.
You know, so as a parent, you understand that maybe their state of denial or they're not understanding.
No, yeah, and
As
it's
a
true
teacher,
because
you're like, they should be in these therapies and
it's true.